Good afternoon.
Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Hey. Welcome back.
It's our last.
This is
kind of
it.
bittersweet. It's bittersweet. It's our final panel.
Closing time.
Yes, this is it. My name is Sika Dagbovie Mullins. I'm here with Carrie Greenidge and Rowan Ricardo Phillips, Maurice Carlos Ruffin, and Laura Warrell for our final discussion. So the title of this panel is Where Does Black Literature Go From Here? And so I want to start off with a quote, if I may. So in 2017, there was a special edition, special issue, I should say, of the journal American Literary History, and the focus was on 21st century African American literature. And so the editor, in the introduction, writes that, or I should say, the editor identifies 21st century African American writers, quote, wide-ranging determination to claim their dead and envision a home for the living.
Ooh, I like that.
So this prompts me to think about how each of you engage with the dead or history, the past, and then home, living, present in your work. And so Rowan, I'm reminded of your poem History in your collection where the speaker thinks they're owed something by the past.
That's a dope poem. I got to say, that is a dope poem.
Yep.
Oh, thank you.
Maybe we can get a reading a little later.
Ooh.
And Maurice, I think about how your novel takes place in the future, right? But it's a future wherein Black oppression recalls and repeats the past in some familiar ways. And Laura, I think about how so many of your characters are running from the past, right? And Carrie, obviously your work in the past, right?
Yes.
Your work on Trotter. So again, I'll just repeat the determination to claim the dead and envision a home for the living. I'm just wondering if your thoughts on how this might apply to your work or how you think of your writing.
So this is actually a very tough question. I think we've been wondering, how do we even address such a big question? But I'll just start off by saying I think that in terms of the future of Black literature, we're trying to go to the same place everybody else is going. And what I mean is, because we're human, you see how the audience has sort of shifted over to where the sunlight is? It's the exact same principle. We're just trying to get free. We're trying to be authentic, have our voices heard, tell these true stories. And I'm hopeful. I think that, at this particular moment, we're in a very good space and a very good place to be able to perpetuate these poems, these stories, these essays. And I mean, look, every time I look back, I'm not a child anymore. I see the next generation come up, and they're even wilder and freer than I feel. So I'm very, very happy about what's going to happen next.
I'll go ahead and add to that. I am so delighted to be on this panel, but I also felt, wow, what do I say? I'm a debut author. I don't know yet. I don't know what the answer is. I feel like we're at a really interesting moment, and I'm excited to be a part of it, in part because when my book was starting to get some attention, the New York Times did a really great essay, if you're interested. It came out in January of last year, and they profiled my editor, Lisa Lucas, with Pantheon, and a lot of other editors. And part of the discussion was, this is a moment where we're not just allowing diverse authors and diverse voices to be a part of the literary canon that we're developing. We're acknowledging that those voices are part of the larger American canon, right? That these are not at the side. These are not simply people that we're allowing to come into the fold. This is part of the American story. It's part of the human story. And I feel like, as a debut author, I'm Black, I'm 50. Now I'm not. Now I'm 51. I'm going to be 52. But when the book came out, when I signed with my editor, I was 50. And the way that the book is structured, the way that the book has been presented, I don't know if that could have happened 25 years ago. And I get so excited by not only authors like us, but I just feel like everything I'm reading about literature right now and books that are being released are by such a diversity of voices. And it feels really exciting that we're finally at a moment where it's not just Black authors, but authors from marginalized communities are here. And people are buying their books, and people are promoting their books. And it feels like, as Maurice said, we might be at a moment that's real and that continues. That's the hope, right?
That's always the question, whether or not this is a real moment, because as Ms. Sika was saying about my first book, it was very much this sort of cyclical nature of how race operates in this country. And so, and two, so I come like an improv background. So, and two, this idea that a lot of the same barriers and ceilings still exist. I mean, you know, I've traveled teaching at, like, last year, Bread Loaf, Swanee, Seaside, Florida, yada, yada, yada. And from some of the young people, I heard the same story over and over again. They had a battle with their editor. Didn't matter the race of the editor, about the amount they would get paid in their advance, about the editorial process, about the way the cover was going to look. And so that tells me that something else is still happening out there. And so I think what we need is readers like you out there in the audience to support diverse writers, to make sure that when you see people from these communities that you're buying their books, that you are giving them out as gifts, and that you're not sort of putting this pressure for conformity. Because what I do see, and I think it's very strange that I'll see a book that comes out and I'll think, all right, this writer's from that community, but was it written for that community? If you want to see what we really like, you have to support the actual authentic work, which is not trying to cater to like a sort of mainstream audience.
There you go.
Did we solve it yet?
We're done.
All right, that's it. Gang. All right, gang.
Well, there's a curious thing about this being the last panel, in that there's something representational about it that I think is beautiful and useful, because the future is never in the hands of an author, right? As authors, we kind of are resigned to the fact that we're going to write it, let it go, and then hopefully it moves on in the hands of others. You've heard from incredibly successful writers. I'll take myself out of that group. But the success of writers that you recognize is also market-related, right? Bestsellers, people buy these books. But buying or not is not really what the future is. The future is in reading. We grew up hearing about writers who don't have access to things, who read them in the libraries. These are the unquantifiable encounters that writers have. The future's not in our hands. We can guess. Honestly, if I knew what the future held, I would write it myself. I, this week, elegied, well, I guess last week now, wrote a little something for the Serbian-American poet Charles Simic, who passed away last Monday. He was interviewed some years ago, and someone asked him, well, who are the great poets of your era? And he said, ask me in 100 years. Mm-hmm. It's the only reasonable answer. Yeah. We don't know, but you certainly know. There's a lot of passive audience participation here. Tell us how to be better readers. Tell us how to be more righteous interactors. Tell us how to create more solvent and plausible characters of color. But this is the panel where really the answers are in your hands. There are no questions for us. Read. Honestly, selfishly, I would love for you to buy my books and buy my wonderful colleagues' books, but just read. You are the future. Whether you're 14 or 84, your reading is the only thing that makes the difference. We all share one thing in common, well, many things in common, but one thing in common is that we come from a lineage where reading was recognized as being so powerful and righteous that they made it illegal for our ancestors, and also made it illegal for any of your ancestors to teach our ancestors to read. You don't need another example of the power of reading and literacy. People used to, before there was paper, find something to chip letters into cuneiform and stone just to have some remembrance of how they imagined things. But that was with the idea that the reader would come. So I want to thank you for being here and just really encourage you to think of this panel in particular as not being the one where we have answers for you, but where you are the righteous participants. You read. You find your libraries. On Fleming Street, there's a gorgeous library here. I grew up going to libraries in the Bronx and remembering how James Baldwin did the same. Yeah. Reading is the only righteous act that matters. You can buy 200,000 books and not read any of them and make us all better off as writers, honestly. Or there can be somebody who reads a book in a library and it changes their life and they write what's next. Right. Yeah. The choice there is obvious, but I guess also as Black Sheep sang in the early 90s, the choice is yours. I hope you choose wisely, and I thank you for being a participant in the choice.
Thanks. Carrie, do you see your historical work as envisioning a home for the living? I mean, it's a poetic way of...
Yeah. I mean, one of these things that I look at as a historian, and my background is in African-American history and African-American politics and literature, is that the role of literature, particularly black literature, as a testament to history. And the fact that I was talking the other day when I was on the panel with Annette Gordon-Reed, the way that we diversify what an archive looks like. And part of that archive, I would argue, is sort of the black literary tradition, and the fact that that often is the historical record. So when we're writing and we're looking at figures, we're looking at this moment and what it will be looking like in the future, I think the literature that's produced in this moment will be the historical archive that we look at in the future in terms of a record of this place. And in terms of the reading and access to books, I would say that there's no better or more significant indication of how transgressive reading and access to literature can be, and the fact that we're still living in a time when people want to prevent what people are reading in schools, right, or in public places, right? And so I would argue that it's a powerful act to read, and from that we get the historical record of the moment we're in.
Yeah. And speaking of the historical moment, I think about, so I teach African American literature, 20th century African American literature, and although I've taught it thematically or organized in different ways, I always find myself coming back to teaching it chronologically, right? Because African American literary production is so kind of inextricably connected to particular historical moments and movements, right? And so I think it's pretty clear that, well, some scholars now, but I'm sure scholars in another 50 years or something who look back at this time will identify the the Black Lives Matter movement as an important historical moment that's perhaps connected to, well, various African American cultural productions, whether it be, right, obviously film, music, literature. And I'm wondering if maybe you can speak about how Black Lives Matter has shaped your writing, if it has, or how you think it might influence the trajectory of Black literature moving forward.
So I think for me as a historian, I think it's comfortable to often argue that, the present should not influence historical inquiry. Right. But I would argue that, all historians are influenced by the present, even if they're not admitting it openly. You study and you engage with history if you are a trained historian based on where you are in the moment, and we all do that. And so I would argue that, one of the ways in which the current political moment, particularly Black Lives Matter, influenced, by the way I approach history is that when I was working on the Grimkeys, the one thing that was in my mind as I was constructing and thinking about the project was the statistic that 53% of white women voted for Trump. And so what did that then mean if we're looking at a historical moment of trying to take the Grimke sisters, who were abolitionist women, slaveholders who, the story goes, fled the South in the 1820s and became anti-slavery activists in the North. And the story we've been told is that this is a righteous moment and these women were self-sacrificing. But if we're living in 2019, 2020, when I started looking at the book, when the 53% of white women are voting for Trump, how true was that back in 1820s when majority of white women owned slaves? And so I really I would say that very directly, the historical or the political moment influences how I approach my historical project. The next project I'm working on is ask the questions of the limits of our capitalistic moment and production, given the moment that we're in at the moment. So I think it all influences, even if you are a historian, and even those historians who try to pretend that the present does not influence their craft. The present always influences the ways that historians are asking questions.
Yeah.
Well, it's Sunday, y'all, so I'm just going to say thank the Lord for historians and for the work that you do.
Yes.
To you, Carrie, also to the Shavers family, the first family of Virginia back there. I see y'all.
Yes, Shavers family.
Because, look, they're always trying to make us forget. They're always trying to gaslight us about history. And what I find incredible is that it doesn't matter like what time period you go to. If you pick out a black liberation movement, so the civil rights movement, the people in Reconstruction, BLM, everybody just hates them, right? You turn on the TV, they're like, oh, these people are terrorists, they suck, they're anti-American, yada, yada, yada. And then, 50 years after the fact, they're like, oh, they weren't so bad. Dr. King was great.
Right.
We love him now, we love him now.
Ali.
Ali, another great example of that. I mean,
Yeah.
the man basically lost like years of his life as a professional in his sport when he was the greatest of all time because of that. And so when I see BLM, I was writing my first book, We Cast a Shadow, during that period, and I was projecting to the future how it would play out. And so I have different kinds of black liberation organizations. There's like a 50s kind of group called BEG. It's kind of a joke, BEG, right? There's a group that's more like radical and like on the ground, like really fighting with their hands and fists. But when it comes down to it, I think that whenever you try to oppress anybody, it's human nature to try and break free of that. And so to watch BLM basically reignite this fight, what you got to understand about black folks in America is that we've inspired movements across the whole planet for decades, if not hundreds of years. I mean, you go to some places like in South America or in Asia, and they'll say we were looking at America and seeing what was happening over there. I was in Amsterdam a couple of years ago, and they were just talking about how like that movement looked at exactly what was happening in America in the 60s and 70s and taking like play-by-plays to run their thing. So, I mean, for me, BLM, I just look at it and say, thank goodness for that. Now, obviously, there's always outliers and distortions, but when it comes down to it, I mean, look, this country was founded on revolution, right? I mean, the idea was the British were like, hey, we own this entire country. And people here was like, no, you can't do that to us. Now, there's layers and layers on top of that. We can take hours to talk about that. But the bottom line is that we have to be willing to engage with the truth of the situation and understand that every community has stories to tell. And so BLM is the same thing. I've read the books by all of the various founders who published books so far, essays and that kind of thing. And I just think that before you judge and you just like, go to Fox News and say, well, they say BLM is like evil. It's like, well, come on, wait. Like, look at your source. And then filter that through and then read the book with a fresh mind.
I love what both of them have said, and I don't feel like I could add anything. And so what you've got me thinking about is kind of the level of craft, because in the book that is out in the world right now, my concerns were sort of elsewhere, but I find myself with this book that I'm working on right now, that the political moment, as it always does, right, shapes the story, regardless of what that story is, what the subject matter of the book is. And I'm finding it challenging to talk about the political moment, right? And part of it is BLM. I'm trying to decide where in the pandemic to place this book. So there's so much happening in the world around these characters. And so part of the challenge, and again, I'm really just coming at this from a craft level as a fiction writer, how do you illuminate the greater issues that are shaping the lives of your character and shaping the story outside of character interaction and the arc of fiction that you're creating or following, and embed the political into it. And I find that really challenging. I would love to talk to you especially about that. But I think it's something that I talk about with my students as well, is how do you present the political context? Or how strongly do you present the political context? And how do you allow it, or how do you allow it to just be sort of conveyed or reflected in what's happening, and how your characters are reacting to their world, and also the story that you're creating for them? And so I don't have an answer to that yet, because I'm literally, potentially after this panel, going back to the hotel to work on it, and that's where I am right now. And so it's I'll just leave it there. I think it's another challenge of being a writer, especially a fiction writer, at least for me, is how, because I don't like the work that's here are the politics and here's what I want to say about it, so that you can't just sort of be imbued with the political, right, rather than being hit over the head with it. So,
but your book that's on that table over there is so, the political is personal. And so to watch the characters in your book, I mean, again, try to find their freedom, so to speak.
Yeah.
To me, that is politics. And that's really what it comes down to. I'll just leave
Thank you.
There.
I'm writing that down.
I mean, I would, before I answer that briefly, I'd just like to say thank you, Sika, and how much I appreciate. You have this is your third moderating panel. I
Oh,
think.
just second
Is this your
to that, yeah.
Well, you've been handling them with like real grace and sprezzatura,
Oh, thank you.
and you have the most heavy lifting of all the writers doing this. And I just kind of deeply appreciate that.
I'm so happy to be here.
You've been hurting us cats. I'm a bit more worried. I guess maybe as a poet, I take the dark turn, but I'm concerned about the ossification or the commodification of BLM. You know, the Black Arts Movement. This, I would say, happened to. We have a sense of, for instance, the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro Renaissance, where basically, you know, Langston Hughes wrote everything. You know, by 22 or 23, Langston Hughes is dead in the public imagination, really. We don't really have a sense of him in the 30s and 40s as being a radical, really left-leaning cat. We tend to ossify moments of Black exceptional radicalism in this country. I would think that happened with abolitionism. It certainly happened with the Black Arts Movement, and with the ever-present looming power and pull of capitalism, it could actually happen now. What does it mean to matter? What is a Black life? And how do we enact opportunities, both educationally and politically, to keep these things festering and in a discursive situation? I think that's really difficult. I'm not saying any of this to be nihilistic. You all heard I'm a strange New Yorker. I'm a devout optimist. But I do think that my concern is healthy. Because it'll keep the I hope keep the wounds open. I like to remember BLM as an incredibly international movement. The way in which I was getting WhatsApps from friends in Copenhagen and in Amsterdam and in London, showing in Vienna, showing people really congregating. My parents are not from America. I tend to think about Black resistance too as you're from New Orleans, so you're basically not from America either, but just as a real diasporic thing. I think a lot about the spirit of Fanon and Sylvia Wynter and people like that. And I'm worried, but not because of the people involved, but just because of the enforcers involved. And I think that it's really easy for us to kind of like take a picture in time and freeze it. A woman in a beautiful dress standing in front of armed guards, or bonfires
with the flowers in their hand.
Or bonfires in the night as somebody's kind of throwing a Molotov cocktail. All those things happened because they needed to happen. But I think the question is, how do we enliven those images into something that's contiguous? You teach African American literature chronologically, not because you haven't thought of doing it any other way, but because it's inherently contiguous. But in order for something to be contiguous, I can bend my joints, my articulations, because there's some type of constantly working movement there. If I don't work those articulations, then I won't be able to move. And if I can't move, I can't offer you my hand. So I'm going to stay worried about it, but I'm going to hope that worrying, like in the blues, makes something good of it.
Thank you. I have a related question that I think kind of merges your comment, Rowan, and Laura's. And back to my teaching, right? So I'm thinking, probably because I'm teaching African American Lit right now. And so we're starting off in the Harlem Renaissance, and I told my students that we're going to be following this debate, or this tension, right, that is strained throughout, 20th century and perhaps 21st century African American Lit, which is at least how it's articulated in the 1920s and such, art for art's sake or art as propaganda, right? So the, African American literature has always faced extra literary burdens, right? And so the pressure in terms of representation and the pressure perhaps to produce art that's deemed political or that is engaging in the realm of social justice, right? Maurice, you just mentioned to Laura, it might not be the most overtly political piece, but that, we should kind of open up the ways in which we think about something as being political, right? As the personal is political. So I'm actually just curious about the ways in which that tension that I'm teaching to my students, art for art's sake versus art of propaganda, might still, is there specter of that continue in the 21st century You all as writers, do you feel that? Do you hearken to that tension between the two?
Between art and propaganda?
Sorry?
Between art and propaganda?
Yeah, between the debate of the kind of art that we should be producing as Black folk, right? I think that's followed us through, right? Hasn't it? From the 1920s to the protest period in the 40s to the Black arts movement in the 60s, Black
Du Bois
aesthetic.
wrote about that so beautifully too.
Well,
Absolutely.
I would say, just as a historian, that I think that, and we've been talking a lot beautifully today and this weekend from people talking about Phyllis Wheatley. And one of the things about Phyllis Wheatley is, for a long time, people didn't consider or vilified her, particularly Black male critics, that she was not political enough. But I would argue that just from a historical perspective, a Black woman who is enslaved writing poetry in which she's talking to directly George Washington or talking directly to an empire is inherently political. And even if the people at a moment in time, say the Black arts movement with Amiri Baraka, or, who was very critical of Wheatley, or even, Malcolm X, who was critical of her at the moment, both of whom I'm fans of, by the way, so it's not knocking them in any way, but, this idea that, that somehow the politics has to be a propagandistic act where you're beating someone over the head with what your politics are, and I think it's kind of a tired, even though it is the argument, it's a tired argument, because just by Black people producing often is in and of itself a political thing. Right, the fact that we're in a the fact that we're in a moment.
For that.
Somebody know out there.
Yeah.
Somebody know.
Amen.
Yeah, so I think that the fact that we're in a moment where, what can people write about and teach about is somehow still up for debate in this country, right? Means that when Black people produce, and when people who are marginalized produce, that in itself is political. Whether you want to say it's political, or whether it's, the cover is like a black fist, it's still a political act that you're doing.
Now you have me picturing Carrie, a book called Flowers in My Garden with a black face.
Exactly.
I think I would agree with that. I feel like, and I do the same thing when I teach African American literature. I go chronologically. I track that debate, and invite my students to think about it, and often have them at the end of the class present something, right? Some reaction to it, whether it's this is a ridiculous debate that we shouldn't be having anymore, or however they fall. But I guess I feel like an artist needs complete freedom. It requires complete freedom. And one of the frustrations that I think, going back to what you were saying earlier about, I feel that we are free when we're home and we're writing our poems or our stories, and then we hit the market. Then we hit an audience. And that's where some of our freedoms are lost. And the frustration, I think, especially, we'll see how it goes for me, maybe the rest of you know better than I do at this point, what happens as you continue to try to build a career, which to me isn't about fame and success and money and being on the covers of magazines. It's being able to continue to write. And it's being able to continue to write the stories that I want to write, about the people that I want to write about, in the way that feels authentic to me and my individual experience, an impression of the world as an artist. And so I hope, as we're thinking about the future of literature and Black literature in particular, that it's that freedom that I know a lot of white authors have always felt and will continue to feel. I wrote an essay a couple of years back. I was in AWP, which is a conference, if you don't know, of just a bunch of writers, tens of thousands of writers. And I was at dinner. It was, you couldn't have written this better for a TV show. It was me, another Black female author, a Jewish gay man, a white woman who was a lesbian, and an Asian American woman, and a white British guy. We were all writers. And we were all talking about all of the expectations that are placed on us because of those demographic labels, right? We have to represent our cultures or our demographic in a certain way, or when we don't do it in a way that the industry or the marketing department or our editors feel comfortable with, we've got to think about whether or not to change it. It was a really rich conversation. It was incredibly fulfilling because we had each other going, oh, It's not just us, and finding the different ways that those, just a barrage of pressures come at us. And at the end of the conversation, the white British author said, "Oh, wow, I never," literally, it was a gift. I was like, great, now you've given me an essay to write, because that's what happened. He said, wow, I haven't had to think about any of that stuff. And to me, that's the freedom that I hope we're moving toward, that we can just sit wherever we sit and do our writing and don't have to worry about what the market is going to tell us we can do or not do, which by extension are those editors and everyone else who's in our ear. So that's the future. And I don't mean that in a Pollyanna-ish, like, that's the future we're headed toward. I mean that in, for me at least, I hope that that's part of the future.
Well, I agree with that, Laura.
Yeah.
And to what Rowan was saying earlier, like this idea that the future decides what the classics are. I mean, I said this at my previous panel. You know, I think Toni Morrison gave us the blueprint. I think the idea is when you write something, so art and propaganda, who are you writing for? Who are you trying to feed with the work? So I'm from Louisiana, I'm from New Orleans. We got this character who's been around for like 50 years now named David Duke. So I've seen him around town a few times. Like when I was a kid, and like I was going like to my dad's job in like the next suburb, I'd like see like signs. He ran for governor one time, right? So I can imagine like sitting in an audience and talking about like my people in a way that makes him happy. Like, you know, those black folks, that kind of thing, right? I'll just stop right there, right? But the opposite of that, what I try and do in my actual work is think about like my grandmother, you know, my aunties. I had 11 aunties and uncles on my dad's side. You know, my cousins, people I went to school with. I went to a 99% black high school. So when I'm writing a book or, you know, an essay or a poem or a short story or something like a script, I'm thinking about the people that I grew up with and who I love, who love me back. And I'm thinking about them sitting in the audience in front of me and how would they respond to what I've created. It should feed them, make them feel good about themselves and their lives, and they should see themselves in the work itself. And so in that way, it is political. Because if Duke reads it, he's like, oh, this is terrible, you know, that kind of thing. But if they read it, they're like, oh, this guy is doing something for us. You know, I'm from a small town. New Orleans is less than 500,000 people. It's getting smaller because of climate change, gentrification. But, you know, to my shock, when I put my first book event on in town in 2019, it was like half the city showed up. I'm just me. I'm not like, you know, I'm not Rowan. You know, I'm not one of these folks. But like, it was like everybody's like, that's our writer. That's our writer. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So to me, it's that simple. Being a few books in, I just think, you know, forget about like how the world sees it and the editors and the politics and MSNBC. It's like, no, this is what I'm doing for my people. If they like it, then it may stand the test of time so that 100 years from now, they'll go, that was the New Orleans guy right there writing the books back in 2020. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So there is a wonderful archive of the events here, which I really encourage you all to go to the websites and check out. I mention that just because I think that the richness of what comes from this seminar is the vapor trail of its passing, that you can come back to it, that there doesn't have to be an immediacy of the body, right? Which is often, right? There's like a fetishization for the corporeal presence of black excellence. But what happens, you know, when we leave like the ancient mariner, right? One hopes that you're wiser and probably sadder the next day. But propaganda it's a word that has a negative pall to it, but it just means kind of like work that has social awareness to it. We're in a case where our work has social awareness to it, whether we mean it to or whether we don't mean it to. It's inherently political, and it inherently pushes against preconceived notions, but it's because the discipline of history never anticipated Kerry, poetry never anticipated me, and fiction clearly never anticipated the both of you. We're uninvited interlopers into hundreds of years of documented texts. And so we're fighting. And I think that that's fine. What I think that's really useful is to give the young kids, actually, the students, a space to think about how to respond to these types of texts. Because I also teach black literature, and nothing depresses me more than getting writing that I feel is very well-intentioned, but could have been about any black work. And I think that that's something that we don't talk about, right? No, it's kind of like in fill in the blank, your book, my book, my book, your book, your book, your book, your book, your book. There are lots of obstacles that are overcome in this way, da-da-da-da-da. There's kind of like a Fisher-Price, my first black, essay type of thing. And it really depresses me because it has nothing to do with the student not being cynical. It's just about kind of like, we all learn how to perform in a certain way. And I don't want us to learn how to kind of like have these performative reflexes to black literature, either as writers, but also as students. So one book that I've taught that I love teaching, I don't know that I'm going to teach it again, is Paul Beatty's The Sellout.
Oh, so good.
Now, I say I'm not sure if I'm going to teach it again, not because it's not great, but it's a book that absolutely does not allow you as students or we as teachers to do the typical thing. This is a story of slavery to uplift, right? Here are the obstacles. How do you find agency in your voice? It completely is on you, constantly. And I find that that type of intervention could get you fired, but it's a very also necessary type of intervention, because it's very easy for all of us to be put on skates, on a treadmill, and just kind of like have ways to respond to each other. We meet each other now. We walk around, you see us, right? And I hope to God we don't all have the same types of conversations. So the question becomes, how do we have sincere, I don't believe in authenticity, but how do we have sincere human interaction? Even like Yeats said when he turned 50, 20 minutes more or less, it was so great, my happiness, that I was blessed and could bless. How do we have those moments when we feel blessed and can bless, and not as though we're keeping it moving? I don't know, but I do think that regarding art and propaganda is the real thing. That we can all get through this being completely like, oh, I'm white and you don't think I'm racist. I'm black and you think I'm smart. I'm a student and you've given me an A. We've all kind of had this transactional thing, but we haven't gotten anywhere, right? And that to me is also incredibly scary. So obviously, as you can tell, I'm into uncomfortable conversations. And so I'm looking forward to having uncomfortable conversations with you all later over drinks. But that to me is what I think about Sika.
We don't want those Chat GPT interactions, that AI, reproduce thing. Funny quick story. I haven't met Paul Beatty yet, but the original title of my first book, We Cast a Shadow, was The Sellout. His book was coming out as I was wrapping my book up. I'm like, we tried to do the same thing, but I love that book so much because of what you said. Like, the mission was to make people feel a little off center about this discussion.
Absolutely.
What do you expect from people that look like us? And how do you think you should behave in that situation? Like, well, okay, this is all just a facade. It's a show.
And that, I think, is the real tradition. That's the heart of the tradition.
Well, and what you're saying is that black literature is not taught well. I mean, that's the problem we have, is that it's taught as, this piece where somebody overcomes an obstacle. And I for somebody who's read and studies black literature and history, that's not the story. If that's the way it's being taught, then that's wrong. I would say unequivocally, historically, that's incorrect, right? And so that's a problem with the teaching and not with the literature itself, right? So I would never teach Phillips Wheatley as, here's a young woman who was enslaved and she overcame.
Right.
That's not what she's saying, right?
Not
At all. There's nothing you can read about Phillips Wheatley that would say that. That's sort of the way that and so that comes back to the commodification and the way that we look at black literature, is that every moment people have the tendency to misunderstand because they're taking the moment that they're in and using whatever they want to extract from the black experience in that moment, say 2023. That's what they're putting into Phillips Wheatley in 1778, right? And there's a lot of Phillips Wheatley in 2023, but there's also Phillips Wheatley in 1778.
She's definitely one of those people where they're like, who would you want to have dinner with, living or dead? I want to sit with that sister and be like, so tell me about what Massachusetts in 1760. Because I've literally had people, like with that first book, sort of like white allies, like DM me in Facebook, like, I'm reading your book right now. And I'm not even exaggerating, like 5 or 7 times around page 70, they stop sending me messages. Because that little anti-performance thing where I'm like, now you're seeing yourself in this book. You thought this was going to happen. Now you feel uncomfortable about it. Now you don't want to talk about it. It was designed to do that to people, as they're reading the book.
May I add, when Rowan mentioned the sellout, I immediately thought of We Cast a Shadow. They're so similar and in intertextual dialogue with one another, and their kind of wildly adventurous critique. They're similar texts in that vein. So I want to make sure for the last panel we do have some room for Q&A, so I want to end with at least a question, which is maybe like a shout-out question, because the title of this panel is Where Does Black Literature Go From Here? So I'm wondering if each of you can share with the audience today either an emerging writer or a lesser-known Black writer to kind of give a shout-out as, you know, maybe a representative of the future or of folks writing now that we all might not know.
Oh, that's so easy for me to do that. All right. So New Orleans, real quick, New Orleans is 305 years old now? I was the first novelist to publish internationally, I think, from New Orleans.
Wow.
And my friend Sarah Broom was the first nonfiction writer to publish internationally. Her first book, Yellow House, won the National Book Award for that book, right?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna put you on notice now. Don't miss this next writer, all right? This is a poet. Her name is Charisma Price.
Okay.
Her book comes out in almost exactly 1 month.
I know Charisma,
Yeah, Charisma is born and bred in New Orleans. I read the manuscript. I blurbed it, Kava blurbed it.
Tell her I say hi.
Jericho, I'll tell you said hello. The book is called I'm Always So Serious, and it is a genius, brilliant book. Charisma Price, I'm Always So Serious. It's gonna win everything when it comes out. She coming for your hearts right now.
I see folks writing it down. That's great. Charisma Price. Wonderful.
I've got one. Her name is Kashana Cawley. She wrote a book called The Survivalists, which I think came out a week or two ago.
That was gonna be mine.
She stole your comment.
Foil beginning.
I wanted to get in there because she's getting a lot of press. You
Yeah.
might have already heard about it. And I reviewed it for the New York Times. And as I said, I'm 50. I don't know how old she is, but I felt like we're different generations. And it was really exciting to me to read. I felt like, not necessarily that I felt like an old person, but I just felt like here is the new generation telling their stories of how they see this country, of how they see this world, of how they see technology, of how they see the political situation we're in. And I just find it really exciting. And so it just feels like there's so many young writers who, they're blowing my mind. And again, it's not just the writing itself. It's just they're seeing things that I'm just not seeing.
What's the name again?
It's called The Survivalists. It's about a young Black woman. She's a lawyer. I think she must be a millennial or Gen Z. I don't always know where that cutoff is. And she's unsurprisingly feeling very exploited by her law firm and dating. And she meets a guy who is living with doomsday preppers and building a collection of guns, an arsenal of guns. And again, as a Gen Xer, I'm like, what? How is this, you know? But what she does with it and what she says, and it's also really funny. She wrote for The Daily Show and something on Fox. So it's funny and it's smart and it's interesting and it's fresh.
Yeah.
So Kashana Cawley, Cauley, and the book is called The Survivalist, and it is out now. So sorry, but
Yes.
yeah. Have you read it?
Well, oh yes, I got
Yeah.
an advanced
Yeah.
copy of it.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. It's great.
It's fun.
That's 2 votes for that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want me to go while you think of
I gotta think of another one. Yes. Well, see now you all are having my historian route show where I'm like, oh, I read a fascinating book on like the history of such and such, but that's not what you're talking about. So I need to come to another one.
No, you can share that too.
Go ahead. I'll think.
I mean, I feel like I'm in a fish for a person, they have fish for a day. Teach a person to fish, they have fish for their life type of situation. So instead of picking a book, I'm actually going to suggest a method, which is to go to your wonderful local bookstore. The bookstore here, Book and Books, is absolutely wonderful. I know that you're coming from wherever, but I could not encourage you strongly enough to get into the habit of going to your bookstore once a month and building a relationship with the staff there and saying, what's out now in this realm? Do you have anything good by young Black authors that excites you? And building a relationship from there. If they don't know, they should. But I think that that's a method, and also going to your local library in that sense as well. I grew up making relationships that way I have a lot of respect for the staff in bookstores and in libraries, and I really think that.
We love libraries, we love educators.
And that's the way that
bookstores.
things feed yourself. I think that encounter in reading should be a type of constant set of surprises. And just like once a month, go into your bookstore. If you're here and you could see Lori, you're the luckiest person in the world, right? But just kind of go into your local bookstore once a month and say kind of like, what's coming out, what's there, whether it's in history or fiction or poetry, and do that, because my voice is an authoritative voice, no matter how kind of like silky smooth and sweet it might seem. And I don't want to be an authoritative voice for you, because my tastes are my tastes. But I do want to encourage you, once again, to make human connections with people who are doing the same thing that you're doing, which is kind of making sacrifices and living with the stakes that there's nothing more important than literature. And you'd be surprised the type of relationships that you then make, and how you learn certain things about publishing, even if you're not in the publishing industry, by doing things like that. So, well, and also, I would recommend, I think this is also literary. There's an actor called Jonathan Majors. He's a phenomenal actor. I think that his work approaches the literary, and I think that we're all kind of, we've been talking about music, we've been talking about films, we've been talking about all types of different genres, and I think that black film now, contemporary black film at its best, is doing incredible things that really touch on the complexity of our past, our present, our future, and that his roles and the way in which he thinks about portraying these types of moments are also really wonderful. So I would just top off with checking out Jonathan Majors' filmography, on top of really getting to know your bookstores and how they relate to black text. And if they're not giving you answers that you like, you're learning something about your bookstores, right? And about your library, which is also really important.
That's true. Carrie, have you had enough time to?
I feel like I'm in grad school, where it's like your oral exam. We're like looking at you, trying to get you to say. I mean, the survivalist is great, but I would building up on what you were just saying. I think support your libraries. I know it's not. I'm not like searching for like anything, but libraries are under a lot of pressure now, and are facing things that no librarian who's been trained in being a librarian is kind of equipped to deal with. And so going into your libraries and even taking advantage of the texts that are not necessarily new, but are in sections that are being harassed by certain people, and go in and be a reader who says, I want to read that book, right? That has a powerful statement in a powerful way. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's a perfect ending to this really great panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we might have time, for any questions for our panelists for our final session of the week.
I see a lot of hands up.
There's a hand over there. Yellow.
Please stand. We'll come to you over here.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is there a way for a non-black writer to do justice to a black character, or is it something to just not even attempt at all?
That's the biggest question there is. I mean, I think it depends on the intention. I think the biggest problem is when we have certain books where somebody tries to center a community with which they're not familiar. Like, they don't have anybody in their family who's a part of that community. They haven't lived in that community. They're just sort of like doing this fantasy type thing. We recall the whole American Dirt thing a few years ago. That kind of thing happens every few years. Like, there's some book comes way up, and with me, I think it's more like the marketing of that book. I think they kind of like put it up as this sort of like essentialist experience of what it's like to be from Mexico and come to America and then yada, yada, yada. That being said, I think it's a long journey. Look, I'm a cisgender, straight, black man, and so that's my experience. But what I do try to do is write for my community. So in my community, I have queer family and friends and classmates. Of course, there are women, and there are people who are transgender. There are people who are, here's the crazy one. We have conservatives in New Orleans, which is weird because we are a very liberal city. So I have to represent those things within my scope. But I will tell you that this is a true story. I can always tell when I'm going out ahead of my skis too far. So, for example, the book I'm writing right now, which is set in the 1840s and 50s, this is black folks in New Orleans. Some were free, some were enslaved. And I didn't know this till like 5 years ago. We had a thriving Chinatown. And so I have a lot of friends who are Asian American in the city right now. I'm like, well, I just have one of the characters, like the fifth main character be Chinese American. And I was writing that character and I was kind of going, bro, you're not telling this correctly. Something is missing here that's just not quite right about it. So then I have to ask myself the question, why am I trying to do this? So the answer I would give to that is read Alexander Chee's essay. You can find it on Google. He gives the best possible answer to this, where he just lays it all out for you. And it's a series of questions for yourself. You know, why do you want to do, I won't even say the entire thing, but just check it out.
It's like a Bechdel test, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
There's a white writer, Jess Rowe, who wrote a really, I think, good essay about, as a white author, whether he can do that. I believe it's in the New York Times. It's a little old now, that I think is worth reading as well. Any other questions?
Hey, Luann.
As Maurice knows, I've been working with press and doing a lot of work with grittier material, which there are a lot of presses that do not want you to publish because it's too disturbing, it's too depressing. And I wonder how you all have run into that type of situation. Have you run into a situation where your work is is called problematic because it's too harsh? So just that's my question.
I haven't, no.
I guess what I would say is no. I mean, I'm at least with this book that's out now, not really. But I do find myself, as I write, worrying about that. And I'm doing things with gender and sexuality in this next book that I worry a little bit about. And I feel like, and again, this is just coming from the writing process. I'm not thinking about the rest of the world yet. And I'm just trying to, I'm putting it out there. Maybe this is a tip, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to do about this question that's in my mind is I'm just gonna write it. I'm alone, this is happening in private, I'm gonna write it, and then I'm gonna go back and see how I feel about it. But no, I mean, I actually haven't really had that experience. And I guess what I would say if I did is, what is it that whomever finds problematic, and is it something that, why are they finding it problematic? And is it something, can they explain it to me in a way that makes me feel like, well, that's actually okay. That's what I'm trying to do, or that's what I'm trying to say, or whatever it is that you are responding to, I don't have a problem with. And if that's the case, then I would say, sorry, this is what the piece is. And if it's not for you, I'll find somebody who it is for. But I am open to the idea that something might be problematic or too gritty or too challenging. And if what I'm hearing is, well, it might be responded to in this particular way or interpreted in this kind of way, and there's something that I can do about it on a craft level to make sure my intention is coming through, maybe do it. But I guess I would say, if they're coming at it from the market can't bear this, or readers don't want it, this is too, maybe that's not something of your concern.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, to that point, I think it's a problem with the literary magazine market, and I come from that world. I went to grad school, so I participated in like being a reader and publishing stories there. I think it's a genre question. I mean, oftentimes, and I think Tanana Reeve was saying this the other day also, it's just there's this sort of pushback for things that are non-literary. So if it's sci-fi, fantasy, Western, mystery, thriller, horror, a lot of these magazines are kind of like, oh, this is too gritty or too weird or too strange. But the fact of the matter is that those are the most popular genres in the world. I mean, look at all the major TV shows, you know, Squid Games, Westworld, Game of Thrones. Those are the biggest TV shows in history. People love to read those kinds of stories. So, you know, I mean, of course I know you, but I applaud you for seeking out those kinds of grittier stories. Because obviously, well, not obviously, but, you know, for as successful as this country is, we have a violence problem. You know, men against women, you know, white folks against everybody. Sorry, y'all, sometimes. You know, straights against people who are queer, that kind of thing. And I think that sometimes these stories can bring out some of those truths in ways that quieter literary stories can. So when I'm writing those kinds of stories, I'm not trying to like do trauma porn, but I'm just trying to show, hey, I'm from New Orleans, this is what we're like in New Orleans, you know, like it or lump it. And frankly, what I found is that because a lot of these magazines are afraid of those kinds of stories, if I like put extra style on it, it stands out. So my theory when I was in grad school was, okay, it's hard to publish a short story, so my trick was this. They've never seen a story like my story. And so I would enter the contest, and I won like 3 contests in 1 year because they've never seen a story that is like that. So just, you know, be yourself and just tell the truth and don't, you know, play anybody's like fantasies about what you are, what your community is. And it tends to work out because great work will out over the long term. A shout out to the first known writer in Heduana from 2830 BCE. Her writing was done at like 5,000 years ago, and we know her name today. So just be yourself.
Well, you know, I actually have one more thing to say. This is making me think of a lot of thoughts. I just wrote about this in an essay. My MFA program was very white, and which a lot of MFA programs are. And I wrote a short story about a black woman in Boston where I lived, and she's riding her bike through a neighborhood. And if you know Boston, you know some neighborhoods you don't ride your bike through without being conscious of the fact that you're not supposed to be riding your bike through there. And so I mentioned that. The story wasn't about riding your bike as a black person in Boston, but it was a moment for a black character. You are aware of that when you're in a space where you are not welcome, which happens a lot in Boston for everybody. Well, not everybody. Anyway, so my workshop responded so violently to that moment in the story that for the first time in my life, I left a workshop and cried. And I went to my white mentor and I told him what happened, and he said, well, if you mention race in a story, especially like that, it's going to draw all the attention. Nobody's going to notice anything else in the story. It's going to be a story about race, and you're going to be triggering a lot of white anxiety. And so if you want to, maybe you shouldn't include something like that. And so I went back to my dorm, and I was like, wow, maybe I shouldn't include anything like that. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. Well, I'm not going to say it that way. Forget about that. Because, A, the assumption he was making is that white readers would respond that way, right? And the default reader was a white reader. But I also felt like, well, I guess then I'm writing for readers who can consume that moment, they can digest it, and they can move through the rest of the story without being triggered and sitting there freaking out and not being able to see the story in its fullness. And so I'm just presenting that as an example of what's problematic and to whom, and if I'm okay with that. Because in the end, I was like, oh, well, I'm okay with that. Because if you have a problem with this story because a black woman in Boston feels nervous for a few minutes, don't read the story. You're not the reader. And so I guess that's how I might respond to something.
Yeah, I'm sorry you experienced that, Laura. That's not cool.
That was not fun.
Yeah.
It was not fun. I almost left that program.
I don't blame
you.
Yeah,
that's, if that helps.
It looks like we have one more question, if we have time. Or, okay, maybe 2. I see you.
So it's kind of a classic story where the writer comes to a producer or a publisher and they say, here's an idea I have, I want to get this published, here's a book, and they're shut down, and there's criticism like this, we don't like that. And I understand sometimes criticism can be constructive and sometimes it's something you flat out don't agree with. And I wanted to ask, I guess this is more like asking for stories, or maybe just, are there times, or I guess, how do you know when you have an idea so good you need it to be out there, and how do you know when you should fight for an idea you have, and how do you know when you should maybe accept the criticism and walk away?
I mean, that's why they pay you the big bucks and no bucks. I mean, the history of art is this sort of internal compass that only the creator of the art really understands and knows what it means. So, I mean, I think probably all of us on this stage have had some piece where we're like, I think this is wonderful. And maybe your friends have read it, and they think it's wonderful also. And then you bring it to a publisher or somebody, and they just kind of go, sorry, kid, it's not going to happen this time. But at the same time, there's this weird thing where if you're a developing writer, and you're still trying to get your skills together, maybe you haven't quite hit all your marks yet, and you're trying to get stronger. Because, I mean, look, I think that most writers have always had that skill within them to write. But 15 years ago, I wouldn't want any of my stories to been published, and they weren't published. I got rejected a lot back then. But at a certain point, I learned how to control my voice, and like that X-Man Cyclops, how to control that beam of power coming to my eyes, that sort of thing. And once you sort of get that done, then it's on them. They're being a jerk, and you're like, all right. If you don't want to publish it, I'm sure somebody else is going to publish it. Because the bottom line is that we are to use that business term, we're the content creators. They need us. There's no movies. There's no MCU. There's no DCEU. There's no Divergent Hunger Games universe without people like us making these stories. And so just have that confidence, but make sure that you're doing your job. Make sure that the work is not, cliched or hackneyed or lazy or whatever.
Man, that term content creator makes me so nervous.
That was for you. Hey, you said you like
We're not producing
nervous
content.
conversations.
We're producing art, That's what I'm scared of, that we get turned into content creators.
Yeah.
I mean, Black Lives is not a content farm.
No.
I'm not, and you know that.
Yes.
But, it's just, it's art. The way that your stuff is good is you got to be reading a lot. It puts a lot of pressure on your work.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you automatically know what's good or what's not, but nothing puts pressure on your work like reading everything.
It's true.
And then you have the luck to find the right editor, and then you take it from there. But Marlon James published a novel called A Brief History of 7 Killings that won the Man Booker Award. That manuscript was rejected 50 times. 50. But there's a process. But there's nothing that hones your sense of what you're onto more than reading. And learning also how to read yourself.
Absolutely.
So you can't write something and be like, this is great. All right, now I'm going to send this to 1,000 people. If it comes back to you, you got to read it again.
Yeah.
And if you're still like, no, I'm with it, send it back out. But I've certainly, had one or two things rejected in my life where I read it and I'm like, nah. And then I work on it. And then other times where I'm like, no, this keeps going. But it's the reading that puts the pressure on. You have to read yourself, and you have to read others. You have to read yourself like an other. And that also develops empathy, I think. And that also helps with Black characters. If you're not Black, it's about empathy. Do you hear someone speaking to you? Do you see someone and take it from there? There's no exact science to it. But I have never in my life met a great writer who's not an avid reader.
Absolutely.
You can write something. You can get away with writing something without being a great reader. You can write something, but you're not going to sustain it. You talked about sustaining. You can't sustain a single thing if you're not
That's
writing
so true.
voraciously. Reading voraciously. You have to read all the time. Everything. That's the grind.
Big hand to that. Read a lot. Please read a lot.
Everything.
read.
Was there a final question?
I think, yes.
Yeah, that guy.
There's someone who really wants to ask a question. So maybe it can be our final question of the day. Oh, and he's rubbing his hands. This is going to be a good one.
Uh-oh.
It's a good question, right? Because it's the last question. All right.
All right. I kind of have a weird question, yeah.
Yeah.
How would you, as experienced and, gritty veteran authors, kind of talk about racism or just hardships around race or gender in a society or time that we don't really have a lot of knowledge about, like societies of ancient Greece or Egypt or something like that?
Read.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. The first part of your question is one thing. The second part is another. If I didn't have, you start with the second part. If you don't have knowledge about it, then you go to the first part. Why are you speaking about it? Right? So if you don't have knowledge about it, you go and get knowledge about it. You educate yourself instead of speaking. I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah,
right?
and just as a historian, I would say this. I am a historian. I am trained in African American, Black studies, Black politics, and Black literature. If tomorrow I wanted to go out and write a biography of Cleopatra, I could not do that, right? It doesn't matter how good of a historian I am in my field. That's not what I'm trained. I'm not trained in that, right? And so I think it would be a disservice to both my subject and to the writing process for me just to jump into that realm because I'm not trained in doing that, right?
Yeah.
And I haven't read enough on Egyptian history and women's history of that time and the debates surrounding Cleopatra and all the scholars who have read Cleopatra. I mean, that's what we mean by reading. Like, you have to be reading, and so I don't think I would have to go back to school again and get my degree in Egyptian women's history in order for me to even attempt to write something about Cleopatra, right? And so I think that's what we mean by when we say reading, and when you think you've read enough, read more, right? It's sort of like a study, and then you enter it, and then you can enter it and do honor to the subject that you're writing about, right? Without just coming in and saying, oh, I can kind of write it. But yeah, I wrote a book about the Grimke sisters and about Trotter. Of course I can write about Cleopatra, right? No, probably not. As much as that's a character that fascinates me, right? I don't have the skills to do that because I don't know enough. I haven't read enough about that subject and in depth enough and sat with it and then had the arguments that historians have or scholars or other writers have been having about this character.
I think what's implicit in what you're saying, and still in regards to your question, is that it's okay not to know stuff.
Yeah.
It's all right.
And, also, I mean, just think about, let's just take this as an example for everybody in the audience right now. Let's imagine you hear that somebody is writing a biography about your life right now, and you've never met this author, right? You don't know who is this person, right? And the book comes out and you read it and you're like, this thing is riddled with inaccuracies, right? That's the way it is for communities, whether they are present or historical. And so even though the idea of 10,000 hours of mastery of a subject is it's kind of cap, as the kids would say, but still, you need to have extensive exposure to the thing to talk about it. So even a good example would be Edward P. Jones with The Known World, or Toni Morrison in general, where they said they didn't do extensive research, but they lived so much of that in their lives. A lot of this oral history from their parents and grandparents' generation, and being in these communities and looking at what was going on, so that when they came to write it and adding the sort of fictional piece to it, it feeds the community and it feels authentic and real, and it actually causes a lot of good rather than harm. Versus, I just see that people over there somewhere, and I want look. I watched an episode from the first season of Doctor Who. Much of that show has been erased because they didn't record things back then. But in that first season, there's an episode where Doctor Who goes to ancient Mesopotamia, the Mayan culture, and it's all British actors wearing brown face in 1964, and it just felt so wrong. And that's the opposite of writing a book that 100 years from now is wow, this is great. This is they got it totally, totally, totally wrong. So don't put yourself in a bad position. Just, you have to do the work. You have to have a sense of humility and a sense of wonder and engagement. And that's hard. It takes a lot of time.
I see it as part of the job, and I see it as part of the fun of the job. When I live in Los Angeles now, and I was writing a scene about Boston, and I didn't remember the subway stop. And so part of my job was to go and find that subway stop. So if you're talking about writing about a culture, a piece of history that is not of your own experience, to my mind, and this is just my opinion, you are required to do a lot of research. And one of the things that I remember when I was in my MFA program, and I didn't quite hear the question, so I might be going down the wrong path, but I remember this was part of the discussion, who writes about what, and can we write about these other cultures, and what do we do about this? And I remember there was a woman who wrote a story, she was a white woman who wrote a story about a black character, and my feeling was she thought her politics and her heart are in the right place. And so she's okay to just go forward and write about these characters. She lived in New York City. I live in a diverse city. I know everybody here. I know their experiences, and my heart's in the right place. I'm a liberal or whatever else. I voted for Obama. So I can, I can write about this black character. And part of the problem that the two black people, as well as anybody else who would be aware of these kinds of things, had with that character is, and that's why I understood, she's doing this because her heart's in the right place, it's well-intentioned, but again, she's depending on her own sense of politics and not recognizing you still have a lot to learn. And I emphasize so many things to my students, and one of them is this, that part of our job is to read constantly. It's the only way you're going to get better. How do I get better? My students ask me all the time. Read. Sure, spend money on classes. Sure, get an MFA, but reading is where it happens. And it's the same with building worlds and characters that are, whoever that was, are you okay?
Yes.
whatever it is that you are, whatever story you're trying to tell that you don't have direct experience of. Part of the work is learning as much as you can. But if you're not enjoying that research in however way you need to do that, do you actually want to write about these people and situations? You have to have, I think, that level of interest in those cultures or whatever it is that you're writing about, that time period. Yeah. It's going to make the entire process much more enjoyable because we forget, right? Like, we're supposed to like this. Yep. And the work that's involved is supposed to be part of the joy of doing it. And to me, research, exploration, talking to other people. I have a drummer in my book. And I talked to a lot of drummers, and I looked for drummers online, and I just watched drummers talk and watched the way they moved their bodies and the references they made. Everything, was musical references. That's really basic work, and that's just because of her job. I didn't know her job. So again, if you're writing about these cultures or whatever else, that's part of the work.
In summation, because
What did you say?
No, I say in summation, because the personal is political. If you're writing about people who are not your people, what happens is you're actually writing about yourself. And so that friend is the ally. Is like, this is my story. I'm the person coming into this space and telling my story. But then what's the point? It sort of misses the point. So I totally take what you're saying. I totally agree. You have to interrogate your intentions. You have to figure out why you're trying to do what you're trying to do, and then move from a place of not wanting to cause more harm.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, with these musical notes behind us and with the sun now taking over the stage, I think that's a kind of beautiful, appropriate ending to Singing America and to this amazing Key West Literary Festival. Thanks so much for joining us till the very end.